Episode 21, Part 2, AD 1415 to 1460. By 1415, the 29-year-old Henry V of England was in a strong position. In his Kingdom of England, Lordship of Ireland, Principality of Wales, and the Duchy of Guienne. He had a treasury in surplus, had recently put down a Welsh revolt, as well as a conspiracy among some of the greater nobility, and had energetically persecuted the followers of Wycliffe, the Lollards, for heresy and conspiracy, to the point of their near extinction. This religious suppression in England occurred at the same time as the Hussite Revolution in Prague was gathering force. With his domestic foes disarmed, Henry looked beyond the perennial ambition of his predecessors to the dukedoms of Aquitaine and Normandy, and coveted the rich crown of France itself. The military campaigns he launched between 1415 and 1419 were hard fought, and in the end remarkably successful. His spectacular victory over the Armagnacs at Agincourt, in English, on the 25th of October 1415, is a perennial theme of English historiography, elevated to the status of a national legend. Shakespeare's dramatization of the events 2 centuries later sealed their mythic outline. But the real war was one of hard sieges in the following years. And it was the Duke of Burgundy's sympathetic neutrality that turned Henry's ambition to be King of France into a realistic political project. In conjunction with the Duke of Burgundy, negotiations between Henry and King Charles VI of France led to the Treaty of Troyes, 21st of May 1420. Henry was to marry Catherine de Valois, the king's daughter, and become regent of France during Charles's lifetime. On the latter's death, the Dauphin was to be disinherited by his father, and Henry, or his heir by Catherine, would become King of France. There would continue to be 2 separate kingdoms of England and France, but ruled by one king. Henry was now the most powerful prince in Christendom, and he, in pious sincerity, promised King Sigismund that once his crown was secure in France, that he would take the cross and lead a crusade against the Turk. However, he died on the 31st of August, 1422, of dysentery contracted on campaign, predeceasing by just 2 months his father-in-law, Charles VI. His infant son by Catherine, Henry VI, came under the regency of John, Duke of Bedford. Up to 1429, Bedford continued to tighten Lancastrian dominion over northern and eastern France, with the English presence concentrated at Rouen in Normandy. Meanwhile, the Dauphin, the Valois claimant to the French crown, remained in control of the regions south of the Loire. In 1423, the Duke of Bedford invited the Parisians to take an oath of loyalty, as the Duke of Burgundy had in 1418. The diarist, known as the Bourgeois of Paris, records that many did so cheerfully, while others did so with ill will. The same source considered it better to be captured and ransomed from les Anglois, the English, than any other faction, but was unhappy about their meanness in not spending money in Paris, and concerning their highly uncivilized notions about catering, to quote a recent historian. To many living at that time, it appeared that an Anglo-French dominion was the future for northwestern Europe, and that, when he came of age, Henry VI of Lancaster would rule the kingdoms of England and France. Back in England, the tendency was for a new hybrid language, Middle English, to rise to the surface and become the language of literate society. The causes of this gradual linguistic transformation of England during the 1300s are still mysterious, and it is a theme neglected by historians, many of whom fail to see that something important happened that needs to be explained. But I would suspect that the confrontational and often bitter experiences of the 100 Years' War played their part in polarizing attitudes and in gradually alienating English literate elites from their own French social and cultural heritage. We should not underestimate the drastic nature of the linguistic transformations involved. Original English, which we call Anglo-Saxon, was a full-blown Germanic language, with close resemblance to the regions it came from, such as Frisian, Danish, and Old Norse. It has been completely unintelligible to English speakers for the past 600 years. The new language that emerged in the 1300s, Middle English, is a compound of this bedrock Germanic underlayer, but with a massive superstructure of French and Latin vocabulary and syntax lying on top. This accounts for the richness of the English vocabulary, with many dual words for the same thing, the German term always being felt to have more substance, more earthiness and thingness to it, and the French term being sensed as belonging to the high or educated level of discourse. Sometimes a French word is Germanized, as in the word beautiful, with the French word beauté, made abstract by the addition of a Germanic full or voll in modern German. When in 1066 William the Conqueror had sent his emissaries to London after winning the Battle of Hastings, they addressed the assembled Anglo-Saxon lords in Latin. At the end of the period when French was a native language of England, Henry V's envoys to the Parlement of Paris allowed the president there express their message, because not everyone could follow their provincial French pronunciation. A Frenchman captured by the English at the siege of Harfleur reported that he found several knights in King Henry's army, bien parloyant François, who spoke French well. However, it is likely that knowledge of French had deteriorated in the century prior to Henry's campaign in France. Instruction books in French had been known in England from the 13th century, but these were for correctness, to improve one's native speech. By the end of the 14th century, elementary French grammars were required to learn proper French. If Henry's joint monarchy of France and England had persisted, and at the time it seemed almost certain that it would, the displacement of Anglo-French by Middle English most likely would have been reversed, and today we would find it the most natural thing in the world that a form of French were spoken from the Scottish Highlands down to the Pyrenees. For it was the utter defeat in the closing phase of the Hundred Years' War that sealed the cultural characteristics of a separate Englishness. In 1428, the idea of such a defeat seemed fanciful. A war of skirmishes and ambushes continued between the Dauphin's supporters and those of the Duke of Bedford, but inexorably the Dauphin's strategic position was crumbling. The city of Orléans itself was surrounded by strong forts and under siege. Its fall would have opened the way to the south and would have compelled the retreat of the Dauphin and his court either to the Dauphiné in the southeast, or perhaps even to Castile, or, more unlikely, but there's some later source for this, to Scotland. Even the biological legitimacy of Charles as Dauphin, the heir to the throne, was in doubt. No one had forgotten the very plausible smear put about by the Duke of Burgundy that Charles was in fact the bastard son of Queen Isabeau by the lascivious Duke of Orleans, with whom, preceding his murder, she does seem to have had an affair. Charles's claim to be the heir to the throne of France may even have been doubted by himself. And then the unexpected happened. As French history is enormously clear about, but which English history is little vague on, a very pious young woman from outside France proper, from Domremy in Lorraine, began to hear the voice of the military saint Michael, telling her that it was her divine mission to go to the Dauphin's aid and to save Orléans. This maid was called Jeanne. At her trial a few years later, the court scribe heard her name as Jeanne of the place called Arques, and wrote down Jeanne d'Arc. She went to the local castellan, Robert de Baudricourt, who was sufficiently impressed by her message to send her on to Chinon, where the Dauphin was, whose advisers sent her to Poitiers for an ecclesiastical examination lasting 2 weeks. Her inquisitors reported that no evil had been found in her, only good, humility, virginity, and devoutness, honesty and simplicity. When she had been told that the king had asked her for a sign to prove her veracity, she replied that she would give the sign before Orleans, quote, "For thus it was ordained by God." End quote. Given the support of Charles, she appeared at the camp of the relief army at Orleans, a 17-year-old girl in armor, on horseback, and bearing a standard. Jeanne must have appeared to the soldiers as a mulier sancta, as a holy woman of salvational religious tradition. Her androgynous self-presentation, in armor and in men's clothes, blended her iconic image with that of the military saints, who since ancient times had been depicted in gentle postures and with soft features. The slight difference was that she imagined that the cause of the House of Valois, as heirs to the crown of France, was somehow the same thing as the cause of Christ and of Christendom. She was, after all, a very young and illiterate country girl. The seemingly miraculous effect of her leadership did indeed precipitate a rout of the Lancastrian troops besieging Orleans. Her reputation was instantly made. She was La Pucelle, the maiden. A campaign pursued in the valley of the Loire took a string of towns, Jargeau, Meung, and Beaugency. The English captains, Lord Talbot and John Fastolf, found themselves on the back foot. On June 17th, 1429, the Valois force again defeated the Lancastrians in the open battle at Patay, where Talbot was captured. Fastolf retreated behind the walls of Paris. The way was now open to Reims. On the 17th of July, 1429, the Dauphin was crowned in the cathedral at Reims, receiving the unction of Clovis on his forehead. The Valois were back in business. Jeanne was captured by Burgundian forces at the siege of Compiègne. Notoriously in French history, the Duke of Burgundy handed her over to the English jurisdiction, whose chief seat was at Rouen. But the University of Paris immediately called for her trial as a heretic. The proceedings were presided over by the Burgundian Lancastrian career bishop Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais and delegate at the Council of Basel. Of the 131 clergy and assessors who played a role in her trial, only 8 were English. The rest were natives of northern France. This is where the later nationalist myth that Jeanne was tried and executed par les Anglais, by the English, falls down. In 1430, there was a substantial constituency in northern France supporting the idea that Henry VI of Lancaster should be the reigning and legitimate king of France. Jeanne was condemned and on the 30th of May 1431 was burned in the Place du Vieux Marché for sorcery and idolatry. She was raised to sainthood in 1920. In the immediate aftermath of that dam burst of senselessly spilled human blood that we call the First World War. To comprehend the political events of the 1430s and later, one must understand the court. The new form of princely court, mentioned above, that was then emerging into the foreground. We have no analogue to this in our present-day cultural and political life. We see glimpses of it in the royal weddings that occasionally fill our fashion and gossip magazines. And yet, before there was anything like a state, there was the princely court, often called the Renaissance court. It was from the princely court that emerged the power structures and institutions of the modern European state. And the jealously acknowledged supreme example of such a court was that of the princes of Burgundy. Throughout the 1400s, the Burgundian court was the leading one of Europe, not through the titular rank of its dukes, who were inferior to the Holy Roman Emperor to their east, and formally they were vassals of their intimate relatives, the Valois kings of France, to their west. But what they lacked for in status, they more than made up for in the style and splendor of their court. Court was the institution through which the princes ruled. it was an instrument of politics and the locus for the exercise of power. This is because the aristocracy was attracted from their provinces and their own power bases to the king's or the duke's court, attracted there in the first place by the splendid, almost magical quality of the festive social life led there. And this magical world of banquets, pageants, jousting displays, hunting parties, and so on, was a stage on which the prince acted out the stage play of his own power and magnificence. Small armies of servants performed the ritualized roles required. At the banquets, which were frequent, the courtiers of the duke's household, but they were his guests, watched as the ceremony of the bringing in of the food was performed by the chief panetier, from pain, bread, and the sommelier, each attended by 50 esquires carrying their trenchards of meats and stoups of wine in solemn procession. Before him on the table the duke had a piece of the horn of a unicorn with which to assay the beverage for poison. 6 physicians were seated beside him to advise on what foods would be good for him. The napkin used by the duke to dry his mouth was reverently kissed by the sommelier, who then passed it to the panetier, and so on. In the vast and cavernous kitchens serving up this gargantuan feast, 25 specialist meat cooks were busy with their spits, pots, hooks, all set out before the great open fireplaces. There were separate sections of the kitchen for the saucerie and the fruiterie, the sauce makers and the fruit preparers. And rushing around the specialists were a swarm of fire stokers, spit turners, scullery maids, storekeepers and polishers. Over all of them on a high stool sat the great cook with a ladle in his hand, as symbol of his high office, to taste the dishes and to deliver the occasional punishment to any slackers passing within reach. The plate the count ate off on grand occasions was of silver or of gold, often elaborately worked, and embodying a monetary value sufficient in times of emergency to be melted down to pay for an army of mercenaries. The extravagance of the nobility's clothing at court was extreme by any standards. Attires, both for men and women, were both extravagant and flamboyant. For instance, men wore shoes with ridiculously long toes, just to mark themselves out as noble, as of being in the know. Indeed, the social phenomenon of rapidly changing fashion first appears at the court of Burgundy, and then in its imitators during the mid-1400s. And it was the court of Burgundy, moving as the Duke moved from Dijon to Bruges to Brussels to Valenciennes to Arras, that created the so-called Flemish or early Netherlandish school of art. The stunning realism of technique of painters like Van Eyck, Campin, and Rogier van der Weyden, working from the mid-1430s, as well as the Burgundian school of sacred and secular music from masters like Guillaume Dufay, Gilles Binchois, Antoine Bouzmois, and others, whose style and successors conquered Italy for generations. Burgundian musicians were preferred as the choir masters of the papacy at Rome. The high art music of what is called the Italian Renaissance was in fact Burgundian music, from the still non-classical north. The master metaphor of the whole court performance was the honouring of the prince, the centre of all attention. Seemingly all-powerful and benevolent, the prince bound the great magnates of his provinces to him only by the paying out to them of great pensions and perquisites. Thus the most powerful figures at court were the grand pensioners, the great magnates and relatives of the duke who received stipends from his purse to keep them sweet. Failure to disperse on a grand scale was taken as a slight to their honour and could lead to serious trouble. For, beneath the ceremony, gallantry and pageantry, these courts were snake pits of conspiracy and deadly plotting. Everyone was vying for position and for control over a greater share of the spoils. These spoils existed, in terms of revenues, offices and estates, because the new princes had solved the problem of how to assert their authority and legitimacy throughout their domains. They could extract huge sums in regular and often in extraordinary taxation from their subjects, rich and not so rich, especially from the bourgeois of the towns. With such revenues, the duke or king could run a stupendous court, a place of continuous festivity and of serious politics. They could buy the loyalty of the greatest and more dangerous of their subjects. And they could pay for large bodies of archers who were their personal bodyguards, as well as for the mercenary armies they needed in times of war. But such seeming power could evaporate very quickly. In France, the English aristocracy were notorious for repeatedly cornering and murdering their kings. The French magnates were at least as likely to seek to overthrow their monarch as the English were, but the details of their conspiracies reveal them to have been more sensitive to the religious transgression involved in murdering a defeated king. They planned instead to place him under their own tutelage. Indeed, the greatest service done by Jeanne d'Arc for the House of Valois was the rekindling of the peculiar religion of royalty, which had attached to the French crown since the time of Saint Louis 2 centuries previously. After her death, two great transformations in the situation created the conditions for a decisive end to the 100 Years' War. The first of these was the decision of the Duke of Burgundy, Philippe le Bon, not to pursue his father's grand ambition to seize the hegemony over the Kingdom of France, of which his own dukedom was a major constituent element. The Treaty of Troyes had promised him the lieutenantship of France, effectively a sharer in power, which was not forthcoming from the entourage of Henry VI. Indeed, the Duke of Gloucester formed a marriage alliance to implant his own power more firmly in France, and Bedford, the regent, refused to hand over the county of Champagne to Burgundy as had been agreed. In his wrath, Philippe le Bon of Burgundy decided to desert the Lancastrian alliance and to realign himself on generous concessions to the House of Valois, that is, to King Charles VII. He sent his officers to the Faculty of Law at the University of Bologna to obtain a legal judgment of the invalidity of the 1420 Treaty of Troyes. The French king paid out handsome pensions or bribes to the duke's advisers, such as his chancellor Nicolas Rolin, to whisper in his ear the advantages of the Valois alliance. A conference at Arras in Burgundy resulted in the isolation of Bedford and the English cause, as Philippe switched sides and reconciled himself with his father's assassin of 1419, and recognized Charles as Roi Français, while formally freeing Burgundy from vassalage under him. Both the Council of Basel and Pope Eugenius in Rome sent letters affirming that the Duke was no longer bound by the terms of the Treaty of Troyes. The resultant Treaty of Arras of 1435 pulled the strategic supporting strut from under the English dual monarchy in northern France and in Paris. The English magnates in France were obliged to consolidate their positions in Guyenne, centered on Bordeaux, and on Normandy and Maine, centered on Rouen. Philippe le Bon, Duke of Burgundy, turned his attention to cementing his authority internally, absorbing the large possessions that had fallen to him through marriage, the richest and most urbanized region north of the Alps, the area which is today Belgium, Holland, and northeast France, as far as the Somme. This became the new Middle Kingdom, an echo of the original Lotharingia of the 800s AD, the richest and potentially the most powerful princely state in Europe. As a prince also of the Holy Roman Empire, the Duke of Burgundy began to encroach upon the regions along the Rhine and into southern Switzerland. This new Greater Burgundy formed a real polity and was to remain as the main opponent of the Valois monarchy of France for more than a century to come, climaxing in the mid-1500s in the encirclement and near extinction of Valois France by the heirs to this heritage, Charles V of Burgundy, of Castile and Aragon, otherwise known as Charles von Habsburg. The withdrawal and inner consolidation of the new power of Burgundy from the contest of the 100 Years' War set the scene for a reversal of English fortunes. But it was the intelligence, innovativeness, and resolve of King Charles VII that brought about their collapse. The new strategic realities flowing from the treaty with Burgundy soon showed their effects. In April 1436, Valois troops entered Paris. The plains of the Ile-de-France and the Upper Seine Valley were again the homeland of Charles VII, not of Henry VI, as King of France. Legitimacy was sliding back to the Valois side, even in those territories which for the previous decade and a half had been quite comfortable with English rule. Henri Beaufort, the Cardinal Bishop of Winchester, who had been born in Anjou and in 1427 as cardinal personally led one of the disastrous crusades against the Hussites, was a member of the Royal Council at London and the main financial underwriter of the English position in France. He tried to offer a compromise to renounce Lancastrian claims to the crown of France in return for the status quo ante of the entire Hundred Years' War, that is, recognition of English dominion in Normandy, Maine, and Guyenne. Meanwhile, low-level warfare and pitiless devastation continued, especially in the frontier lands north of Paris. This brought about a sea change in public attitudes. The people, that is, those sections of society not directly involved in the power struggle, yearned for peace. They wanted an end to the repeated chevauchée of the nobles on either side, riding through the countryside, destroying randomly. And above all, they wanted to be freed from the curse of the companies, the thousands of well-armed brigand mercenaries who were far more dangerous and destructive in peace than they were in war. And they were prepared to pay for a solution to their problems. In many districts, burghers, townspeople, and peasants submitted to regular direct taxation by the king's agents. In others, the estates or parlement willingly voted aides, as they were called, and paid the taille and the gabelle without demanding in return limitations on royal power. This is a crucial feature of the evolution of royal taxation and the relative power of the estates under the French monarchy. The immensely long experience of the anarchy brought by war placed a premium on physical security over traditional liberties. People wanted freedom not from an arbitrary king, but from being the helpless victims when a chevauchée swept through one's district or when a company of écochères set up nearby and began stealing and raping at will while seeking wealthy candidates for kidnapping for ransom. An implicit pact was taking shape between subjects and their king. He was to suppress the écochères and bring about a peaceful settlement with the English, and they, the subjects, would reverence him as their sacral protector and overlord. The interests of the House of Valois regarding the companies coincided with those of the inhabitants of their domains. King Charles VII saw clearly that so long as these companies, at the command of their redoubtable and brutal captains, remained free formations within France, any coalescence of magnates could summon up a powerful army against him on short order. As the chronicler Jean Cartier wrote at the time, quote, "These captains always vowed some promise to one of the lords of France, which was the cause of the evil they did." End quote. To deal with the nuisance, in 1439, Charles issued a military ordonnance, which was both his personal order and the setting of things in order. This set out a novel principle, that no one in the kingdom had the right to raise or employ mercenary companies except the king. In its essence, this flew in the face of every understanding about the noble form of life, as free independent warriors, that had existed since the collapse of Roman imperial power in the Occident. To be a lord meant to come to war with one's personal contingent of warriors, one's clientele and dependents. In the 1400s, coming to war meant coming with a large mercenary army as one's paid clients. At first, the ordonnance was purely theoretical and was ignored. But matters soon came to a head. One of the very greatest magnates, the Duke of Bourbon, had his mercenary troops in Alsace and Lorraine. The king enticed their captains, quote, as much by douceur, sweetness, as by the use of money, end quote, to move to aid him besiege the city of Meaux, 50 kilometers east of Paris. However, they delayed their progress for 2 months, becoming preoccupied with holding for ransom the inhabitants of Auvergne, Rouergue, and Berry. As the royal court moved to Angers to celebrate Christmas in 1440, the Duc de Bourbon met with other magnates, those of Alençon, Vendôme, and a man called Dunois, who had been with Jeanne d'Arc. The young heir to the crown was also there. They were determined to render the military ordinance a dead letter, refusing to clean out the undesirables from their troops' ranks, and refusing to muster them before the king's captains at the appointed place. The war they waged against King Charles was called the Praguerie, after the Hussite nobility's rebellion in Bohemia. The Dauphin Louis, the king's son, remarked that the king's personal guard of Scottish archers, captained by a man called Nicholas Chambers, quote, kept the kingdom of France in subjection, end quote. In June 1440, King Charles of France said, quote, not wishing that my said Lord of Bourbon and his supporters should do with him as the English did with King Richard, end quote, had 6 of that duke's captains arrested. He brought his own forces to try to catch Bourbon at Loches, but he escaped to Poitou, where the Duke of Alençon and the Dauphin Louis were in arms against the king. Charles besieged and took each of Alençon's strong points in Poitou. This prompted the Duke to seek an alliance with John Holland, Earl of Huntingdon, Henry VI's lieutenant in Guyenne. One day, when leaving Mass, Charles was given the news that Saint-Maixent had fallen to Alençon, and that the royalist citizenry had taken refuge in one of the city's gate towers. He hurriedly ate a light breakfast and took his troops immediately to relieve the tower the same day. He then besieged the castle above the town with both siege engines and cannon until the garrison surrendered. He had 25 of them decapitated, sparing the remaining 60. Alençon and the Dauphin went to Auvergne to join with Bourbon and besieged Montferrand, which was loyal to Charles. The king came with his troops from Poitiers into Auvergne, some 800 knights and 2,000 archers, to take one strong place after another. In May 1440, peace talks were held in the houses of the Franciscans and Jacobins outside Montferrand. The king asserted his rights to place his officers within Alençon's and Bourbon's lordships, and stated that, quote, all the war of the said kingdom belongs to the king and his officers, and to none other, and there is none so great in the said kingdom that he can levy war nor retain troops without the authority, commission, and command of the king, end quote. This is a set-piece statement within its actual historical context of the truth expressed by the sociologist Max Weber in 1919 of there being a Gewaltmonopol, a monopoly of violence, which is the fundamental premise for a functioning state. Here, in its embryonic historical form, it is the claim to that monopoly by a prince. Dauphin Louis, then an adolescent of 17, humbly begged pardon of his father. Bourbon and Alençon retired to their lordships on submitting to the king's terms. But it was not until 1445 that some semblance of order was brought to the companies. Charles's ordinance of June that year raised a temporary army from among the now unoccupied écorcheurs. Their ranks were purged of the more blatant criminal elements, and crucially, they were paid a regular stipend. The problem then was what to do with them. The time-honored historical storyline in France is that once Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, had revived the king's spirits and the loyalty of the French people, that Charles then energetically set about suppressing internal treachery and then concentrated all his efforts on defeating the English. This was not actually what happened. A great company, sitting idly, waiting for the next war and opportunity for plunder, was a dangerous instrument. even to its employer. The first thought of Charles and his entourage was not at all the so-called English occupier, but something more attractive in the form of an Italian venture. Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, was involved in a long war with Venice, trying to constrain his territorial ambitions. The Venetians won the Battle of Casalmaggiore in September 1446. Visconti sought the military aid of the Valois king, offering him and his relative, the Comte d'Anjou, the county of Asti and the lordship of Genoa. So Charles's new royal army of erstwhile écorchers marched into northern Italy and in 1447 were soundly defeated near Asti by a Milanese Venetian army. It was this setback that turned the king's attention away from ambitions in Italy to consideration of taking Normandy, for Normandy was a viable political project. It was done because it was doable. By 1449, Charles had raised a royal mercenary army of 12,000 mounted lances and organized an archer militia composed of a levy on groups of households, each responsible for equipping, training, and supporting an archer. These were hugely expensive. Of the 1.8 million livres raised each year by the king, a full half went on paying and equipping his new force. The campaign to reconquer Normandy was carefully considered. King Charles appointed commissioners to look into which estates were to be confiscated when the conquest was completed, and to which of his noble lieutenants they were to be distributed to. These noble war leaders knew they were fighting for their own personal fortunes. So too did the English captains and lords entrenched in their castles in Maine and Normandy. They resisted tooth and nail to keep what they held. In Guyenne, in the southwest, after centuries of loyalty and interconnections with the English crown, the Gascon nobility and merchant class were actively willing to fight to avoid becoming subjects of the King of France. They knew the confiscations and taxation that was planned for them. And so, between 1449 and 1453, a war of piecemeal sieges took place of one castle and one walled town after another. Gradually, the strongholds of Normandy fell to Charles's noble captains. In 1449, Rouen was besieged and taken. Bayonne and Bordeaux were taken in 1451. An English expeditionary army of 3,000 men under John Talbot appeared before Bordeaux in 1452, and the citizens joyously threw open the gates to him. A set-piece battle took place on the 17th of July, 1453, at Castillon, where 300 cannon were deployed by the French side. Talbot's forces were destroyed. This clash finally ended the Hundred Years' War and ended, save for the toe-holding of Calais, the English presence in France, which, though before this time it is hard to describe it as English, had lasted for 3 or 4 centuries. Within a couple of years, tensions at the top of the English elite had descended into open civil war on the island, beginning with an armed clash at St. Albans in May 1455. A convulsion of civil war is a normal historical occurrence when a political community suffers a catastrophic external defeat. The so-called Wars of the Roses were to last 30 years before the Tudor dynasty established its hegemonic position. The climactic conclusion of the Hundred Years' War occurred just a month after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, and it helps explain why there was no substantial effort to save it coming from the Latin West. Writing in the 1770s, Edward Gibbon remarked that, quote, "The spirit of the Crusades had expired. In the 11th century, a fanatic monk could precipitate Europe upon Asia for the recovery of the Holy Sepulchre. But in the 15th, the most pressing motives of religion and policy were insufficient to unite the Latins in the defense of Christendom." End quote. What was the situation in the West in the 1440s? We already know. The city to whom Constantinople had always turned, in its need, mighty Venice, was locked in a land war in Italy with the Dukes of Milan. Genoa was under imminent threat from being annexed by the relatives of the King of France. That king and his adversaries, the Lancastrians, were grappling with one another in the end phase of the Hundred Years' War. The Habsburg Emperor of the West, the Holy Roman Empire, not yet called of the German nation until 1486, Frederick III, was constrained to deal with the encroachments of the Duke of Burgundy to his west, with the disorder on the highways of the empire caused by the rampant activities of the brigand barons, and above all by the difficulties he faced in Bohemia in the aftermath of the Hussite phenomenon. When the East Roman Emperor Joannes VIII Palaiologos and his great party of ecclesiastical dignitaries made their way back from the Council of Florence in 1438, with the documents of church union in their luggage, the emperor was returning from a free, rich, and turbulent Italy to the darker confines of his walled city, surrounded by the Turks and riven by internal animosity towards the great religious concession that he had made to the Latins. In their 2-year absence in Italy, the city had been bereft of its religious seniors, and, according to Gibbon, this had given free license to the more intransigent lower clergy. The emperor stepped off the Venetian galley at the Golden Horn to a chilly welcome. He had given way on what the clergy and people believed to be the essentials of their religion and identity, and had returned with no great Western army. It seemed a bad bargain. There was, however, one sign of hope coming from the west, from the kingdom of Hungary, where their young king, Władysław, and his war leader, János the Wallachian, known to history as John Hunyadi, were repeatedly beating the Turks in battle. Hunyadi, who had started his career in crusades against the Hussites, had learned much from the new military art he had witnessed while on a visit to Milan. He showed that Christians with quite small forces could defeat major Turkish incursions into Transylvania and elsewhere. In 1444, Władysław and Hunyadi led a crusading army to invade Turkish Bulgaria, with the intention to press on south to Constantinople. Arriving at Varna on the coast, they failed to find the Venetian ships they had been led to believe were awaiting them. Instead, news arrived at their camp that Sultan Murad had crossed the Bosphorus from Bursa and was coming against them with a force twice the size of theirs. The Battle of Varna on the 10th of November 1444 was lost through the chivalric impetuosity of the young King Władysław. Another chance to save the mother of cities had been lost. Murad's son, Mehmed, was groomed from youth to rule after him. Pious Islamic teachers were appointed to equip him mentally for the task. Among them was one Akshemseddin, who inculcated the idea that it was his Islamic duty to extinguish the Roman Empire by conquering Constantinople. This schooling had an abiding influence over Mehmed's adult life. In 1451, when news arrived that his father had died, Mehmed was in Anadolu, Anatolia. He immediately crossed the Hellespont with a select guard and soon arrived a mile from Adrianople, where the whole Turkish populace came out to do obeisance before him, recognizing in the decisiveness shown by the 21-year-old the figure of the legitimate sultan. His first act, as was expected, was the immediate seeking out and slaughter of his male siblings. Congratulations poured in from the emperor at Constantinople, as they did from the Latin princes of the West. Mehmed's first action was to take the army to Anatolia to bring the Karamanids to submission. This cleared the way to turn to focus on his life's dream, Constantinople. On Mehmed's return in 1451 to Rumeli, the Roman lands, as the Turks called the European side of the Devlet, he ordered the construction of a fortress at the narrows of the Bosphorus, north of Constantinople, at Azomaton, opposite an existing Turkish castle. Today it is an attraction called Rumeli Hizari, happily pointed out to tourists on boat trips up the Bosphorus, its tragic significance remaining unknown to them. The fortress was originally called Bog Hazkezen, the Channel Cutter, because it was intended to choke off the Italian trade route to and from the Black Sea and to cut supplies to Constantinople. Work began in March and finished in September of 1452. The workmen didn't hesitate to demolish the remains of Christian churches in the suburbs to use to fill the 22 feet thick walls and towers. Horses left to graze amid the crops led to resistance by the Christian peasantry, who were slaughtered. When finished, it was garrisoned by 400 janissaries armed with heavy cannon. A Venetian ship tried to run the blockade, but was sunk by a direct hit. Dragged in chains to Adrianople, the men were beheaded and the ship's captain was impaled. As the winter of 1452 passed, the view from behind the walls of Constantinople, from where the massive Turkish preparations on all sides could be seen, was a bleak one. Emperor Constantine XI turned again to the west, and in particular to Venice. His ambassadors offered John Hunyadi the lordship of the city of Mesimbria. To Alfonso of Aragon he offered the island of Lemnos, if they would come. At this point, Cardinal Isidore, the Metropolitan of Kiev, re-enters our story. He had been with the Emperor's delegation at the Council of Florence and had been a passionate pro-unionist. He had returned to Russia in 1441 and tried to impose the Union, but the Grand Prince of Muscovy, Vasily II, had deposed him and imprisoned him for 2 years. The Metropolitan escaped and returned to Rome via Lithuania. In October 1452, he arrived by galley at Constantinople as the legate of Pope Eugenius, bringing 200 archers with him from Naples. The Union of Florence was proclaimed and solemnized in Hagia Sophia. The monk Scholarius penned a denunciation of all who subscribed to this betrayal, who, as he said, had turned their backs on God. A meeting of the city's clergy was held in the palace on the 15th of November 1452, at which the dissenters signed a joint document of protest. But the sound of Turkish guns firing in the Bosphorus beyond the city walls were more effective than the tirades of Scholarius, who retired. On the 12th of December, a joint celebration of the liturgy according to the Union of Florence was celebrated in the Great Basilica of Hagia Sophia, at which the Act of Union was read aloud. It was at this point that the phrase, quote, "better the Turkish turban than the Latin mitre," the bishops had, was attributed to the East Roman magnate Lucas Notaras, who would play a major role in the coming siege. It was widely believed in the city that Constantinople was prophesied to fall on the 7,000th year of creation, which was calculated to arrive in 1492. Many therefore believed that the end had not yet come. As the spring of 1453 broke and the full realization of the scale and significance of the coming siege had become clear, the Constantinopolitan elite rallied, burying their eternal differences. A Venetian colony pledged its ships, and 2 Venetian captains returning from the Black Sea vowed to stay to fight. A noble genuine, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, responded to the emperor's appeals, and on his own personal account raised 700 troops at the Greek island of Chios, then a Genoan possession. His galleys arrived at Constantinople in January 1453. Because of his known expertise, the emperor gave him command of the land walls, where the main Turkish assault would come. Giustiniani had with him a sapper and military engineer called John Grant, whom the East Romans thought to be German, but who may have been Scottish. A flotilla of Venetian ships slipped out of the harbour in February, bearing refugees back towards Crete. Georgios Sphrantzes reports with confidence that a total of 4,773 defenders were in the city. When the siege began, there were 26 ships of war in the harbour. Modern estimates put the Turkish besiegers at 80,000. In other words, the defenders were outnumbered 16 to 1. The Great Chain floating on a boom, was strung across the entrance to block access to the Golden Horn and thereby prevent an attack upon the sea walls from that more vulnerable side. The land walls had never been breached since they had been constructed in the 400s AD. But they stretched for 4 miles across the peninsula and were designed to be defended by a densely deployed force. By 1453, Constantinople was a shrunken city, its occupied core far distant from these outer walls, save for the imperial palace complex of Blakane adjoining the northern end of the walls. But now there was a new factor: artillery, unplanned for by the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who had built the walls in 413 AD. Mehmed had commissioned a Hungarian cannon founder, Urban, to cast him an immense bronze bombard, which was dragged from Adrianople with 60 oxen. This cannon founder also manufactured a number of lighter and perhaps more effective bombards to flank it. In February 1453, 2 ships from Venice arrived at Constantinople with 800 soldiers and a promise that more would follow. This raised spirits greatly. George Branković of Serbia sent troops to the Sultan and not to Constantine. On Easter Monday, April the 2nd, 1453, the advanced Turkish camp was set up on the landward side of the city. The bombardment of the walls started on the 6th of April. The great gun shot 1,200 hundredweight balls, but could be fired only 7 times a day. However, it was inexorably pounding against the ancient brickwork. After a few days, rubble from the collapsed section of the wall was filling the moat. 2 galleys sent by the Pope and a grain ship sent by the King Alfonso of Aragon from Sicily broke through the blockade to bring some relief to the now desperate city. On the 22nd of April, Turkish ships, which had been hauled over the Isthmus of Galata, were sighted from the walls of the city. They were in the water of the Golden Horn, behind the chain. The effect of this was to dilute the defenders manning the land walls, for the sea walls were 14 miles long. The Turks had begun undermining, that is, digging under the land wall. The military engineer Grant constantly countermined them. A huge siege tower was brought over a portion of the filled moat up against the wall, but it was set on fire and destroyed. A scouting Venetian ship set out and came back to say that no Venetian rescue fleet was on its way. Notaras, who had said that it was better the turban than the Latin mitre, and Justiniani began to accuse one another of treachery. The anti-unionist clergy and some of the panicked populace shouted abuse at the emperor in the streets, saying that their prophecies of doom were being fulfilled. An ultimatum from the Sultan was delivered, which the emperor rejected. In Islamic practice, this rejection allowed the emperor to promise his soldiers 3 days freely to plunder the city that had knowingly rejected the prophet. On the 28th of May, the attacks suddenly ceased in order to rest the Turkish army before the final assault. The emperor had the holy relics and icons brought out and processioned along the walls. That evening, both Latins and Greeks crowded into Hagia Sophia to pray for deliverance. The anti-unionists fell also under this spell and came into the church to pray, as did the greater part of the whole population. This was to be the last great moment of the Roman Empire and of the Church of Constantine, with 1,000 years of heritage behind it, and everyone there, shaking with terror for what would happen to them in the morning, knew it. In the darkness of night, Emperor Constantine went to the Blakane palace to bid farewell to his family and his household, and then did the last inspection of the troops on the walls. One can only wonder what words of comfort he found to give the men looking out from those battlements. The attack began before dawn on the 29th of May and was concentrated on the St. Romanus Gate. The first wave was beaten back, as was the second, with great casualties. Then While the defenders were nearing exhaustion, Mehmet sent in the Janissaries, with drums thumping and horns blaring. Just before dawn, Justiniani, who had been fighting already for hours, was wounded. This broke the resolve of the defenders around him. The Janissaries saw the hesitation and pressed their attack. The Genoese retreated behind the second wall. Some say they were unable to close the gate behind them before the Janissaries were upon them. Nobody knows what happened to Constantine, but it is pretty certain that he decided to stand against the onrush and be slain, probably at the Romanus gate. Every account reminds us that this was an act of suicidal heroism by Constantine, the last of an immensely long line of Roman emperors, stemming from Augustus Caesar. I think it is clear that he was fully aware of this himself. The Turks swarmed in. Quote, "Every living thing that stood in their way was slaughtered, and the streets ran with blood. Whole families were butchered or separated to be sold as slaves." End quote. Gibbon tells us, and other more modern accounts differ little in the details, that as news spread back through the vast city that the walls had been breached, that the people, men, women and children and the old, streamed in panic out of their homes, forming several great rivers of human desperation, propelled as if by some force outside themselves, away from the danger behind them and down the ancient Roman streets of the tapering peninsula towards the one spot that they knew was the center of their lives, the Basilica of Hagia Sophia that Emperor Justinian had erected 9 centuries previously. They crowded in, imploring the altar for deliverance, wailing and screaming. When the time came, and it took some time, when the first Turkish armed men arrived in the atrium outside, those inside closed and bolted the great bronze-coated doors. But of course the booming of the battering rams merely intensified the horror of their entrapment. The doors burst open, and the Turks, their blood up, rushed in, their eyes wide with greed for slaves. And the men were separated from the women and children, families torn asunder, fathers wrenched from their wives and daughters. The chronicle tells how ropes were used to bind the men together in long lines, while the women were tied together with their own girdles. This now human merchandise, the Greco-Roman Christian population of Constantinople, was led back to the Turkish camps outside the walls to be sorted and auctioned into a lifetime of slavery to their new masters. It was the end of the world. At about midday, Mehmed himself rode his stallion down the Mesa, the great boulevard that ran from the Golden Gate to the Basilica and the Great Palace. He first entered the Hippodrome, scene in bygone centuries of so many triumphal festivals. His attention was drawn to the entwined bronze snakes on the chariot arena's central spina, as it was called, the intact votive offering given to the gods at Delphi in 478 BC, in thanks by the Greek city-states for their victory over the Persians at Plataea. Taking out his scimitar or a mace, he struck off one of the heads. On entering the basilica, the great palace had long since lain in ruins, he is said to have stopped a Turk from hacking up one of the blasphemous mosaics, reminding him that this was the Sultan's share of the spoils. He dismounted and had the mullah mount the pulpit and cry out in a long warbling intonation the Islamic profession of faith. Hagia Sophia was immediately converted into a mosque and remained so until the Ataturk regime reclassified it as a museum in 1931, after which many of its mosaics, but not all, were revealed from the pious coating of Islamic plaster under which they had been hidden for 500 years.